event. This is a partnership. It's a cycle of debates that Nexo Jornal and MADI, the Center for Research in Macroeconomics of Inequality, are carrying out. The title of the entire event is Who Pays the Bill? Tax Policy for Inclusive and Sustainable Growth. This is a very important debate. As you probably all know, this is a presidential election year in Brazil, and taxation and the future of taxation is really in the center of the economic debate and agenda. The event we'll have several panels in this event, and this is our first panel on global tax arrangements, building unified solutions to collective problems. And we'll count today with the participation of Professor Jayati Ghosh and Rodrigo Orair. Professor Jayati Ghosh is a professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She holds a PhD from Cambridge, has lectured for many years at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She has authored and edited 19 books and nearly 200 scholarly articles in development economics, most of it. And she has received several prizes, including for distinguished contributions to the social sciences in India in 2015, the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Research Prize in 2010, and other awards. She has consulted for international organizations, including the ILO, UNDP, UNCTAD, UNDESA, and UN Women, and she's a member of several international commissions, including the International Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRICT, which is one of the reasons we decided to start with this panel and have Professor Jayati on this panel, which is exactly on corporate taxations. And in particular, we're very interested in discussing the role of developing countries in these new arrangements. Rodrigo Orair, who is also with us today, is a researcher from the Brazilian Institute for Applied Economic Research, Ipea. He's also a research associate with the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth and the Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequalities at USP, MADI. And Orair has also been awarded, has also received awards, especially with the National Treasury Prize in Brazil, and is one of Brazil's greatest specialists in fiscal policy and taxation. So I'm very glad to be chairing this panel and mediating the conversation here. I thank Professor Jayati Ghosh and Rodrigo Orair for accepting to be with us today. We have 1.5 hours for the panel, and the way we'll structure this is that I will start by framing the topic and asking a general question so that Professor Ghosh and Orair have a first round of comments of around 10 minutes. Then we will move forward with more specific questions to both panelists and also with questions from the audience before ending our panel with closing and more general remarks. I encourage both presenters to also make comments to each other's presentations and discussions. Of course, the idea is that we have a dynamic conversation here and a dialogue between both of you. To start with our context here. So for at least 4 decades, we had a framework and an economic policy framework that through globalization and also the role of trickle-down economics has strengthened tax competition as the way countries have moved forward and competed, leading to a reduction in world corporate taxation in what many have considered to be a race to the bottom. Estimates give, at least to give you a number, estimates are that tax avoidance by multinationals in particular are responsible for a loss in fiscal revenues of the order of $240 billion a year, to the world, and this has been, of course, put into question for many years, and now more recently, not only since the pandemic, but probably also thanks to the strengthened support for a new welfare state, which requires increasing expenditures in social protection, healthcare, green transition investments as we recover from the pandemic. Also, the election of Joe Biden in the United States last year, all these things have played into what some have considered to be the end or a paradigm shift and the end of the era of trickle-down economics, which culminated in a new agreement, which was signed in October 2021 by 136 countries at the OECD, which was announced as a reform of the international tax system that set, among other initiatives and policy changes, a 15% global minimum tax rate on certain multinational companies. So the way I would like to start this is to ask you both, how do you see this change? I mean, first of all, is this agreement a paradigm shift? Is it part of a paradigm shift in taxation and the way we think about corporate taxation? What has changed in the view that economists and policymakers have on the role of corporate taxation? What could explain these changes, and whether you see this as a real change or as maybe something that is way below or what we would expect in terms of transformation in taxation. So thanks again, and I'll start with Professor Ghosh.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for framing the issue so clearly. So let me begin by pointing out, exactly as you mentioned, that what has happened over the last 30 years is not just that average corporate taxation rates across the world have fallen by more than half, but that even within that, the big multinational corporations are paying next to no tax, maybe 2%, 3% maximum on their estimated profits. And they're doing this entirely legally. They're not evading it. They are making use of the available loopholes in the system. So what's the big loophole? It is really that multinational companies are not treated like one company. They're treated like individual companies in different countries. So you will have Apple Brazil or Amazon Brazil, Apple France, Amazon France, Apple US, Amazon US, and so on. And then these companies supposedly trade with each other. This enables these companies like Apple and Amazon or any multinational to transfer a lot of their profits to the lowest tax jurisdiction. And then if they have double tax treaties and they have other kinds of benefits, they can get away with paying nothing, which is really what they're doing. They're transferring to tax havens in Europe, like the Netherlands or Ireland, or Liechtenstein, or they're transferring to tax havens in the United States, like certain states like Delaware and so on. So how do we prevent that? The commission that you mentioned, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, Jose Antonio Ocampo is our chair. And we have been arguing for some time that what you need to do is to treat that company as one unit and say, this is your global profits. This is my country's share of your global profits. So Brazil's share of Apple's global profits will depend on a combination of users, employment, its share of sales, and so on. You have a formula. So you take sales in that country, employment in that country, maybe users for digital companies. And on the basis of that formula, you say, this is my share of your global tax profits. I will tax you according to my tax laws, the same as I tax domestic companies. So that's the first leg. The second leg we've been saying is that to make this also still important for multinational companies to be confined to, you say, let's have a minimum global tax, because otherwise they will still have an incentive to move around. Now, what's very important about this latest OECD process is that they have agreed to both principles. The idea that you have to recognize that a multinational company is one company globally, and the idea that you should have a minimum global tax. Both they have recognized. So that's a huge step, because all these years they were not even accepting that. Having said that, because of corporate lobbies, let's admit it, the way the agreement has been formulated, it amounts to next to nothing for the developing world. So what's happened is, first of all, that we were saying have a minimum corporate tax of 25%. Why? Because that's the median of all the global corporate taxes. Half the countries in the world have higher tax rates and half have lower. So 25% as a median would still mean that a bunch of developing countries, we have higher corporate tax rates, would still be lower, but it's at a reasonable minimum. The United States, the Biden administration had first suggested 21%, which is lower, but still not so bad. But the agreement at 15% is so low that it's almost meaningless. It is the same as the tax rates in Ireland, which is a tax haven, 12.5% for Ireland. So it's ridiculous to have such a low rate, and developing countries that have a higher tax rate are now going to face a problem because the companies will still shift to the lower tax regime, if you see what I mean. So there is a real problem at the very low global minimum tax, and it also gives very little money in terms of the additional money that would accrue to developing countries. The other part of it is this sharing of global taxation, the ability to tax the total global profits. Instead of taking that basic principle, what they have done is created this absurd distinction between routine and residual profits. Now, what on earth is that? They say, well, up to 10% profit rate is routine, and anything above that, which is residual, that's the part you can tax. There is no corporate taxation in the world that does that within a country. You don't say, oh, we will allow you 10% of your profits without profit rate without taxation. They say we're taxing all your profits. It's an income tax, just like wages and salaries, right? It's an income tax, so you tax the whole thing. Here you're suddenly dividing it up, and then you're saying 20% of that amount you can then divide up and share. So it is absolutely reducing it to almost nothing. Developing countries will not even get maybe $1 billion additionally out of this. And very few companies are eligible. Only the top 100, 150 richest companies in the world are even eligible for being considered for this. So the whole proposal has been watered down to such an extent that it's really delivering nothing for developing countries. And what's worse is that in return for getting nothing out of it, developing countries are being told you have to give up on any unilateral measures you have taken, like say a tax on digital companies. Many countries have done that. India has done that, for example. You have to give that up, and you have to submit to an international arbitration proceedings, investor-state dispute settlement. I don't have to tell you in Brazil what that means. It basically means that governments are held to ransom by private companies, and pretty much the private companies get away with murder. So developing countries are being told to give up on all of that for this absolutely illusory gain. And that's very unfortunate, because the basic principle that has been accepted is very important and we must preserve that, but we really cannot accept a deal that makes things worse for us. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. This is a great start. I will, without anything at the moment, any other comments, pass to Rodrigo Orair. Comments on the same issue.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and everyone with us. Thank you, Professor Jayati. It helped a lot for me. It made it much easier. To begin with, let's get to the point of trickle-down economics. I think we must separate the taxation at the personal level and at the corporate level. The trend to reduce corporate taxation, it goes before the 70s, and it's still going on. It's still on, okay? And I'm not sure that this trend, that this change, this new agreement will change that. So at the corporate side level. At the personal side, the personal income tax, especially when it has to do with benefits to the capital and to the richest, this one seems to be changing. It's not clear, but we have a change since 2008. And it seems that after the pandemic, that this has changed, this paradigm has changed. Going back to the corporate income taxation, I'm not sure, okay, that this is going to change. And this agreement, as Professor Jayati told it, it's not a paradigm change, okay? It's not a big structural change. What happened, as she has pointed, we treat companies as, instead of a unit, multinational ones, as several arms. With globalization, with several loopholes, it's very easy for a company to shift for profits to where else, somewhere where profits are under taxed. This is all legal. And what is important, this is, you are not moving assets, you're not creating jobs, you are simply moving paper around. There are several loopholes where you can do it. This is a problem for the developed countries. Developing, it is, but it's a big problem to the developed ones. And the solutions that they came to the agreement, they were channeled especially for them. The problems got much bigger with the digital economy. The digital economy has some specificities, such as they rely much more on intangible assets. They are much more widespread. They have a problem of, oftentimes, they don't have any physical or even a presence at the local markets. So they have several characteristics which make much easier for them to move profits. And then you start to have a fight mainly between rich countries. On the one side, European ones pressuring to move some basic principles of the corporate income taxation. The basic principle there is to tax where the profit is originated instead of the destiny, where is the consumer. Then you have a technical debate, I'm not going to the details, that has to do with the contribution of the data from the consumer. And then European countries, of course, they don't have the big companies of the digital economy. They were pressuring to bring this to the destiny, to the markets where are the consumers. Of course, the United States, they were against this kind of solution. They wanted to be taxed at the origin, of course. So you have geopolitical, you have commercial interests all behind that. Then European countries start to create their DSTs, their digital service taxes, unilaterally. Then the companies themselves, they get to do, look, this is bringing a lot of uncertainty. We've got to deal, get to an end, get to agreement. And they actually did, okay? They actually did in the end of the last year. How can we say that this agreement it is historic? It is. It is a big change in the sense that we're not talking more about political debates or tech. Now we're talking about implementing it until 2023. At the same time, it is very frustrating from the lens of developing low-income and middle-income countries. It's extremely frustrating. And at the same time, it might be promising. We may change that. So going into this agreement, it is called the two-pillar solution. It was designed within the framework of the G20 and the OECD, even though they have this, what they call this inclusive framework with non-member countries. So you have up to 140 countries, 136 signed the deal. You have basically two solutions. The one is designed to deal with the challenge imposed by the digital economy. And this is the one that Jayati mentioned before. What did they do? They said, look, let's take a look to the 100 hugest multinationals. Most of them are from the technology sector, digital economy, digital enterprise, okay? They make a profit around $1.5 trillion a year. And I'll say, okay, let's forget the normal profit, which is around $1 trillion. And now we will reallocate the right to tax these residual profits to where the consumers are, independently from the fact that the enterprise is there or not. Okay, so this is what the Europeans were demanding. This is the solution they got. But look, you have only the extra profits, not the normal ones. And even from these extra profits, is only a small part which will be reallocated. So you will reallocate 1/4 of the extra normal, of the excess profits that these big companies make. $125 billion. It's a very, very, very small amount. And more than that, okay, the amount is small, and the criteria to share is not well designed at the lens of the developing countries. So you get this 125 billion profits, and you reallocate mainly from some rich countries who are the headquarters of these big companies, as well as some countries, especially investment hubs or tax havens, that this profit is being moved to, and you give the right to tax for the whole number of countries where the consumers are. In terms of revenues, this has a very, very small impact. You're just taking right from one to other ones. The expected revenues of this first pillar of the solution is at most $15 billion for the whole world. It's very, very small amount. Okay. For Brazil, it's less than 1 billion, just to give an example. But still, you do have a redistributive impact of this measure, okay? Because you're taking from very specific ones, investment hubs and a couple rich countries, and given to the whole. So you still redistribute. However, the second pillar, and this is the one that is designed for the rich countries, has the opposite effects. So you end up having no distribution after all, okay? This second pillar, it is the minimum tax, which Jayati has already mentioned. You have a minimum tax of 15%. And how will this work? Okay, you have the company, you have a subsidiary, and then you give the right for the country where is the headquarters of the multinational to tax the difference between, to give an example, to make it better, suppose that you have a German company which has a subsidiary in Singapore or Ilhas Cayman or Ireland. If these subsidiaries are not being taxed at the minimum level of 15%, Germany will have the right to tax this difference to bring it to the 15%. So mainly the direct effect of this mechanism will benefit the headquarters, okay? The country where is the headquarters. In specific of big companies. So we're talking about rich countries. The direct effect of it is mainly for them. Of course, that we may discuss indirect effects, which may benefit, may give beneficial, may be good for a wider group of countries. But still, this has a more of a concentrating effect than a redistributive one. On the whole, this does has an, if you get together, if you sum up direct and indirect effects, we're talking around 117 billion US dollars. It's not that big. And a very small amount of this being channeled toward low and middle income countries. And just to get a point to Professor Jayati, the estimates I've done to Brazil, we're talking about the two pillar, we're talking about at most 2.7 billion US dollars. it's not big. You know, it's far, far away to solve any fiscal problem, and far, far away from the expectations that a developing country like Brazil were aiming with this initiative and this agreement. I hope to have been clear, and I hope that the debate, we can go deeper in this detail, into these details.
Great. I think this was a very, very good start. So what I get from both initial comments is that the deal is clearly not favoring developing countries, right? For several reasons. So first of all, the actual rate that was established, the 15%, is lower than what we wanted if we're thinking of actually raising fiscal revenues to fund social expenditures and what we need in the developing world, right? Second, the rules were designed in such a way as to favor countries where the headquarters are. And in that sense, of course, developing countries that do not have many multinationals are, of course, getting a lower share of whatever fiscal revenues are raised through the measure. And then on top of this, there seems to be, there seems to be problems and other loopholes when it comes to this idea of the profits that are routine profits and the profits that are residual. So as far as I get, basically what we're getting from this is that world inequalities and global inequalities may even increase due to the deal when compared to the previous framework, which is something very alarming given where we are at this point, right? So I would like to start by asking Professor Jayati, who has been taking part in this commission, and the commission itself has signed a letter, has written a letter after the deal that exactly warns that this deal was benefiting a small number of rich countries, and that all these, the ways this was set up are actually harming any prospect for the developing world in this respect. So what I wonder is whether the commission and other economists who are thinking about this have a different proposal that would include the Global South as beneficiaries of higher corporate taxation, and whether you see a prospect for South-South cooperation in this respect, or if developing countries also have conflicting interests in which would be maybe even harder to think of if we don't see common ground even within the developing country world for action. So is there a proposal that could unite the Global South?
Thank you so much, Laura. And yes, absolutely, there is. But, first of all, I just want to point to the immediate and present danger. This OECD thing, which was passed by something that they call the OECD BEPS, Race Erosion and Profit Shifting Inclusive Process, they are pressurizing developing country governments now to sign on to and ratify, so that it will actually become binding. At the moment, it's not binding, it is still a proposal. Once it becomes binding, we will lose, in fact, any possibility, as I said, of any unilateral taxation, and we'll have to submit to ISDS for absolutely no gain, as Rodrigo has so effectively pointed out. So we have to make sure that our legislatures and our governments do not sign on to this. I think that's urgent because the pressure is to do this by June. What do we suggest instead? Well, the proposal that our commission has made and has been making for several years is very similar to something that the G24 group of developing countries in the IMF and World Bank have also come up with. And it is even supported by the UN Committee on Taxation, FACTI, the panel. There is a tax committee of the United Nations, which has also broadly agreed with it. So what's the basic principle? The basic principle, first of all, is precisely as I said, that you have a minimum tax rate, which is reasonably high and is not close to the bottom end. Okay, so 25% preferably, but at lowest 21% must be the minimum tax rate. Because other than that, there's a real danger that the minimum will become the maximum, that all of us will face capital flight if we don't lower our tax rates to 15%. So we must keep it at above 20%. I still hope for 25, but let's say 21%. The second is that we actually charge multinational companies the same rate of taxation that we charge domestic companies. That's all we're saying. We're not saying put more pressure on them. We're simply saying we charge our domestic companies this much. Let's charge the same to multinationals. What does that mean? It means no difference between routine and residual profits. Everything is taxed. That every company is subject to its global tax, global profits being taxed. That countries decide on the basis of sales, sorry, governments decide on the basis of a company's sales, employment, and maybe capital stock or users, something depending on the nature of that company. So we have a formula. It can be 60-20-20, it can be 70-30. We can figure out that formula. The major part is sales and then employment and either users or capital base. Okay. On that basis, we say, well, Brazil's share of Apple's profits is, let's say, 10%. So if Apple's global profits is 10%, we are charging you on 10% of your global profits, we are charging you our normal corporate taxation. And so if you have to function in Brazil, you have to pay that rate. Otherwise, don't function in Brazil. That's really what we are proposing. Now, ideally, this has to be global. Of course, I mean, that's the way it will work. But we are now seeing that the global process has given us the opposite of what we wanted. It's taken the principle and it's distorted it so much that it's ending up worse, okay? So how do we resist? And this is where it is so important to have coalitions of developing countries, because it's hard for a Brazil or an India or any other country to do it on its own. There will be capital flight, there will be pressure on the governments, there will be pressure from the US and from other countries. So if a group of countries decides together to do this, say even the BRICS countries decide, or if a group of Latin American countries decide, or a group of African countries decide, it is much easier, it's more effective, and it will be almost impossible for them to resist. So this is the moment for developing countries now to begin to act on their own. The only reason we had even a little bit of movement, as Rodrigo has pointed out so well, is that the countries started imposing unilateral taxation. That's the only reason we got movement on this global process. But now that the global process has been turned on its head and been made unfair and unequal again, we need to demand that we as groups of countries are going to put in place something that is based on these two principles. And it can be done. It's not difficult. If there is sufficient political will in enough countries, it doesn't even need lots. 2, 3, 4 countries is enough to actually make it difficult for those companies to resist. Apple is not going to say we will stop functioning in Brazil. So they will actually be forced to make that change and to accept it. And I think it's very important. This is a time when it can be done. This is a moment to seize.
Okay. Rodrigo, starting with this proposal, so if we, let's say Brazil enters an agreement with its neighbors to set such rules and we have an increase in corporate tax rates. I mean, and maybe that helps in a global setting to move in that direction also. I mean, what do you see? And there, I think we have to answer to maybe the first question that would be asked in such a context, which is, wouldn't this lead to lower investment and lower growth in our countries? And wouldn't this lead to capital flight? And wouldn't this actually harm economic growth and economic development? And even if I think evidence in the economic literature has moved towards the direction of at least not showing much in terms of much robust evidence for this idea that increasing taxes is actually harming growth and that lowering taxes is good for growth. Still, I think if we're talking about this type of agreements that only involve certain regions and parts of the world, I think this argument could probably be used by corporations to avoid and to try to prevent this type of deal. So what do you think the effects would be? And maybe it would be nice if you can also tell us a little bit more about the estimates you've produced on what the impact for Brazil would be of the deal and the agreement, and what other types of deals could give us in terms of fiscal revenues, given that the current deal isn't the best one that we should aim for.
Okay, thank you. First of all, it's not there is a bad deal, okay? It's just there is frustrating, all right? It's better than it is today. With the deal, it's better than the situation that we are facing today. So I'll try to explain why it's frustrating and why the estimates for Brazil are so low. First of all, we have a two-pillar solution. The first one is to say, look, you have 100 of the biggest companies all over the world. They make profits out of $1.5 trillion. And Europeans are forcing to make part of this being taxed at the local markets where the consumers are. The Americans don't want it. Those from Ireland don't want it. Those from Hungary don't want it. And they ended up in a deal where less than 10% of this profit, it is in fact going to be taxed at the origin. Okay, so out of 1.5 trillion, 125 billion, a very, very small amount, is going to the origin. And this will benefit Brazil, okay? A part of the profits from Google, Netflix, or whichever, we have the right to tax, something that we are not doing that much right now. Our corporate income tax is one of the highest of the world, okay? We tax 34%, the nominal rate. The effective rate is closer to 25. We are far, far away from the 15%, okay, percent. So we're talking here is about a global minimum of 15. Brazil tax 34, 25, something around this. I'm not going to get into detail, but in Brazil, it's very expensive to send money to outside. So some of these digital companies, they have domestic subsidiaries in Brazil because it's cheaper for them to pay our domestic corporate income tax and then to send dividends that are exempt instead of just sending the money. So they are already, part of this profit is already being taxed here. What would happen with the deal is that this would be compensated and then Brazil would get less right to tax, but still, we're going to have a right to tax big companies, which we do not have right now. Why so frustrating? Because they're giving this right proportional to the sales of the country in the whole pie of global sales. And this benefits the rich countries, both due to demand or supply factors. Rich countries have higher income, they consume more digital service. They also have a better infrastructure, so they have a better supply. So you're moving from an extremely concentrated concept, which is profit, to another concept, which is still very concentrated, which is market sales. So it's frustrating in this sense. You could have more redistributive criteria such as population, number of contracts, and several others, and make this, so you lack this opportunity. That's why the amounts are so small. The second pillar is where you impose this minimum, the right of a jurisdiction to impose an additional tax to bring the taxation of a subnational or of a multinational to the minimum of 15%. Why it is very concentrated? Why does it concentrate a lot? Because you're giving the right mainly to the headquarters. Brazil would benefit from this very, very little. Okay, Brazil just have 2 or 3 big multinationals. There are, construction sector, mining is out, financial sector is not within this. So we do have this very, very small. In this sense, we do not benefit a lot from there. Why is this frustrating? Okay, first of all, that's what Jayati said, 15 is too low, 15% is too low. Okay. Second of all, this concept of benefiting the headquarters, why you could benefit more where the profit is generated. That's what she's pointing there with this independent group of economists. So we could have used a different concept for that. And the third thing is that, okay, we have all this problem with the race to the bottom of corporate income tax rates. Yes, it's a bad, you have fiscal war, but still this is an instrument for is a policy instrument for developing. You're taking away this and you're not giving anything else to compensate. So you could have a different kind of instrument for development to substitute the one that you are taking away. How does Brazil get into this? So first, multinationals that are here in the country, they are being taxed with much more than 15%. So there is no effect in terms of they leaving the country. Brazilian multinationals are in fact being undertaxed in fiscal havens and other locals. We will benefit a little bit from that. So we may impose extra tax on our multinationals, which are just a couple ones. This is not the big. The main expected benefit comes from the floor that you are imposing to the fiscal war. So this may change in the sense that you reduce a little the incentives for companies to move profits, to shift profits abroad. But this is still an indirect effect. So when we sum up all of this, I have the specific estimates, but they amount at most $2.7 billion for Brazil. Okay. It's very, very timid. And then you said, well, are global inequalities going to raise? In fact, not. Okay, they just get stuck. We are going to move to a framework as unequal as it is right now. So this is what is frustrating, because you're lacking the opportunity to make structural change. Okay, you are solving points, specific problems. It's better than today, but you don't change. Just to give an example, rich countries, they have a per capita corporate income tax revenue around $1,400 US. This is 10 times more than middle income countries, which is around 140. And this more than 130 times more than a low country, which has around $11 US per capita. This will remain basically unchanged. Okay, a low country will have a per capita revenue compared to the rich country, which is 130 times more, and this will be still just like that.
Laura, can I add a little bit here? And yeah. Rodrigo, I agree with everything you have said, except that this is better. Okay, and let me explain why I don't think it's better. I think it's actually worse, because once countries accept this and we ratify this agreement, we are locked in to a whole legal architecture that is almost impossible to get out of. And we've been through this before. We've been through this with the WTO. We've been through this with various other global arrangements. Once you sign on to this, you cannot do anything autonomously. And so it will be impossible either for an individual country or for a group of developing countries to bring into place more just, equitable, and viable taxation policies. So I actually think that what you would gain as Brazil for, what was the number you mentioned, $2.7 billion, right, which is pathetic, would be in fact more than overbalanced by the losses you would make in terms of your own ability to impose unilateral measures. I mean, supposing you did impose a 5% tax on digital companies, I don't know how much that would get you, but it would get you something. Supposing you did get together with a few other countries, maybe Argentina, maybe Colombia, I don't know, and decided that you will use these principles for all of the multinational corporate companies operating in your domain, you would get a lot more. So I think there's a real danger. We know that once these things get signed, you're stuck there for 3 decades, 4 decades, nothing moves. And to expose our countries to yet more of this litigation, yet more of dealing with a complex global arrangement that does not serve us, and that inhibits governments from doing anything progressive and positive, I think that's dangerous. So I personally am worried. I was very delighted that the OECD accepted the principles. But then as it unfolded, the way those principles have been distorted has really meant that, you know, we can't do anything anymore.
This is great, Jayati. I will follow up on exactly your last comments. I mean, do you think that these corporate lobbying that ended up distorting the basic principles of something that in theory would be beneficial? I mean, you had global coordination towards an increase, or at least stopping or preventing this tax competition and tax avoidance to become even larger. I mean, how is it? I mean, do you think that in a way there is a difference between how, I mean, economists and even policymakers have been moving towards a new consensus and maybe changing their views on the future of taxation on the one hand, and on the other, I mean, the political forces and how these different power relations play out at an international level haven't changed at all, or do you see at least some corporations were changing, or some actually corporate policies that have been changing as well, or is there hope in this respect, or is the political balance as bad as it has always been in that sense?
You know, I think the political balance is bad, of course, and it has always been bad, as you've mentioned, but it's particularly bad in international negotiations because the corporate lobbies have much bigger access, and they have different kinds of access from what the general public has, or social movements and NGOs. They, you know, those people have access outside, whereas these people have access inside. And so, of course, yes, in the negotiations, and in a sense, because we were following in the commission, we were following these negotiations almost on a weekly basis, we saw how it changed. We saw how the language changed, how we saw how suddenly residual profits gets introduced. We saw every week there was a new thing that was added or changed, or sometimes it's where you put a semicolon that makes the huge difference, you know? And these guys, I mean, the big corporations all hire armies of corporate lawyers to do all of this and to figure out the best way of phrasing it that would keep them still in at an advantage. So I think, yes, we have to recognize that the political power of these negotiations is still very much global corporations hold it. Where can we resist? I think right now, given the situation, where we can resist is in our legislatures. Because, you know, even in our governments, let's face it, most of our governments are in bed with large capital. Certainly my own is, I mean, Indian government, very much so. But how do we then resist it? And the way to resist this, first of all, I think, is to make all of this much more public, to make more and more people aware of what is going on. what it means for them, what they as taxpayers and as people who are paying for government services would lose, and what they would gain from an alternative. So we have to have much bigger public awareness, and we have to put pressure on our legislatures to avoid signing on to something that is damaging and to push for something that is more progressive. Right now, I would say in the next few months, that's the immediate battle. Over 2022, that's the battle. Of course, there's a bigger battle over the medium term, but right now, until about June to September, this is really where we have to fight.
There is a question here from Dolores Brito that exactly talks about, she says, given the urgency of action from the Global South countries, she'd like to know how aware are our governments at the moment of the implications of this new framework? Is there any action already from governments in the Global South? Does it seem that they will sign this agreement at this point, or are there changes being discussed? I think I'll still ask Jayati, who is probably following these negotiations more, and then I'll go back to Rodrigo on some of Brazil's implications.
So I would say that right now there is a lot of pressure on governments in the South to sign on. The OECD is putting pressure, the United States is putting pressure. And there are many ways that they can put pressure, right? They can soft pressure, hard pressure at a bilateral level. So I think most governments are facing huge pressure. There are only 4 or 5 holdouts at the moment who have not agreed to the basic proposal. I forget now, it's Pakistan. It's only about 4 or 5 governments have held out so far. But there is tremendous pressure on everybody to ratify it. And there is very little in terms of coordinated action among Southern governments. In fact, we have not even noticed this. Most of the African governments didn't even attend any part of this negotiation, because this so-called inclusive process, it was all first decided among the OECD countries, and then everybody else gets invited to the table. But it's being invited to the table where you're sitting in the back row, and you're not really getting a chance to speak or to influence anything. Most African governments were not part of this process at all. They probably don't even know what's going on. And many other countries in the developing world have very little knowledge. The governments don't have often the detailed technical capacity to have been following this in addition to all the other zillion things that they have to follow in terms of the global climate change negotiations, WTO, IMF, etc. So they haven't really been following it. Among those who have had some concerns, the Indian government, for example, the technical notes from the Indian government are excellent, from the finance ministry, etc. The bureaucrats have been producing excellent notes, but the political leadership wants to please the US. So we don't know finally what they will agree to. And so as I keep repeating, I think the critical thing is for all of us, and I say especially in Latin America, where I do believe you still have a chance, you can actually change these things, is to put a lot of pressure in terms of greater awareness and greater public pressure on the legislatures and therefore on the governments to actually push for a more progressive stance. It's possible, it's available, it's not something that's impossible to do. But really there has to be that political will.
Rodrigo, I think first, there was a little bit of disagreement there on the impact of the deal. I mean, whether it's maybe Professor Ghosh argues that maybe even if the deal itself, like the actual rules, may give some fiscal revenue to developing countries, still the fact that the deal prevents or at least reduces the degree of freedom to implement our own taxation policies. I mean, in that sense, the deal would also harm our prospects. And as you mentioned, I mean, Brazil already taxes more than this rate. So do you think that the deal could prevent us from implementing more ideal policy frameworks in terms of corporate taxation? That's the first question I have. And the second is, so we have presidential elections this year. And assuming, I mean, if we take the best case scenario, which is the deal isn't signed the way it's now designed, so maybe we do manage, in spite of what Professor Ghosh has given us, which is there is no coordination, but maybe, I mean, we do manage to avoid this, at least removing all our degree of freedom in terms of action by our own governments and also regionally. So if that's the case, I mean, what kind of policies do you think should be, and what kind of proposals should be in the agenda in our presidential elections in 22 when it comes to corporate taxation? I think we have been in Brazil discussing a lot personal income taxation, all the loopholes there. We have been discussing wealth taxes even, but I feel that there is still a lot of confusion and even no consensus built around what should be the policy proposals when it comes to corporate taxation, and even how it relates and how it can be reconciled with our proposals for tax progressivity at a personal level. So do we increase corporate taxation and personal income taxation and taxation of dividends at a personal level at the same time? How do we reconcile these proposals?
Okay, thank you. The first thing regarding the disagreement, I don't know if it's a disagreement. I think we have three scenarios. Okay, the first one, this agreement has ended a period of that we got stuck debating and going nowhere. At least in this last 7 years, since 2015, nothing has happened because people are debating. Not signing an agreement may be the worst scenario as well, which is people are debating, there is no global solution. The second scenario, which is the best one, is that, well, okay, let's do actually one framework which works for us. And this is much what is Jayati Ghosh is defending. Said, look, if we do this agreement right now, we'll get stuck in this for a couple of years and we will be far away our dreams. And then you have the intermediate scenario, which is this agreement right now, which was not designed for us. And this has to do with the fact that we don't have that much of political power within this framework, which is discussing it. Let's get a step back. Where are these discussions taking place? The G20 and the OECD, okay? The OECD used to have 30 members, right now 37. We are not even a member of the OECD, Brazil itself, and they are mostly high-income countries. More than that, Western high-income countries. And this is the solution that they could find right there. Okay, if we can design a better framework where will be more representative in it, maybe we could have a better solution. The only one thing that I want to say, if this is impossible, the deal is better than no deal. This is what I'm trying to stress.
Rodrigo, just let me just stop you there to clarify something. So here I see a point of really of disagreement, which is what I think Jayati is saying is that a deal is worse than the no deal, because at least with no deal, we can have our own policies being approved at a country level or at a regional level. And what you're saying is still a deal is better than no deal. And I would like to understand exactly why do you think the deal does not constrain our possibilities of maybe implementing some policies at a national level?
Okay, so first of all, I think they will depend on the perspective. Okay, so which country are we talking about? Let's talk about Brazil. Right now, the model that is where we lack any global minimum tax, it hurts a lot our competitiveness, okay? Brazilian multinationals move a lot of profits. This is one thing that which is good about the OECD, that they give these country by country reports, and it's very clearly how much the Brazilian companies move profits everywhere. So, more than that, this aggressive practice, as elsewhere, harms a lot our competitivity. And we lack instruments to deal with this. So it's not the dream. No, it's not the dream. But at least having a minimum global tax will maybe get at least a floor, okay? At least a floor, and reduce the bargaining power of multinationals. Because we have a very serious issue here. Multinationals have a lot of bargaining power, and national states lack them. So this will get better. Regarding the thing of but it does has a problem there, because you get stuck with a deal which is not the best. And also has some paralysia. It also has an effect here. For example, the technical solution is supposed to come in 2023, okay? Until there, if you have signed the deal, that's not much to do until to sit and wait. And this also is frustrating, you know, because you have presidential elections, and what can we talk about the solution to the digital economy? Nothing. You have a deal, and now you're waiting for the deal to be implemented. So you have nothing. The alternative is to create a DST in Brazil. And then you say, is it the DST is the digital service tax, okay? We could impose a kind of a sales tax for the big companies. In fact, the deal itself, the agreement, it's very good for the big companies, the digital ones. For example, the expectation of revenues to be raised is at most $15 billion. It's very, very, very small. It's very, very, very small. People were expecting that you could tax more the extra normal. They make huge amounts of profits, but we are not doing it. We're just bringing it to the regular corporate income tax, which applies to every other sector, and not taking this responsibility, etc. So in the terms of, for Brazil, the DST, we don't have much to do. If we sign the deal, we simply wait. Regarding the corporate income tax, one thing that would work, and this discussion brought, is that, okay, the idea of the second pillar is to treat the enterprise, the multinational, as a unit, and to calculate the effective tax rate which is applied in each country. This we have an important instrument for Brazil, okay? Why is that? Our nominal rate for the corporate income tax is 34%. The effective rate in Brazil is around 22, 25. And in some cases, we have not even have profits. They have what's called prejuízo fiscal, what's called losses. And this has to do with several things that you can deduct, and you have allowances and all that thing that make companies to do not even pay 10, to be being under tax, even though you have one of the highest rates of the world. One idea that we can bring from this agreement is to institute a minimum rate on effective profits from companies, okay? There are some experience of countries. This is being is within the BEPS solutions, the recommendation. The BEPS is the base erosion and profit shifting project from the OECD and G20. This is a very important instrument that could help here and get like a floor for the practice of elision and evasion in Brazil. I hope to be clear. I hope that I made myself clear here.
Yeah.
And I hope to have answered properly the question. So.
Yeah. Yes, you did. I have some other questions here from the audience that I would like to take. So one of them has to do with how multinationals outside of the OECD, for instance, in China, including digital companies that are outside of OECD countries, can have a role and can change these arrangements. I mean, is there a difference in the interest of multinationals that are which headquarters are in the US or Europe, and those that are maybe in China? I mean, Rodrigo was speaking of a couple of multinationals in Brazil. I mean, do they have? I mean, how are they benefited or harmed by the deal? So that's the first question here by Dante, and then. Rodrigo, I think Matthias's question was on the fact that the discussion happened at the OECD, and I think that's been answered actually by Rodrigo. I mean, what I would add there is that there are negotiations for Brazil to enter the OECD, and this has been happening and is ongoing. I mean, would this change anything? In what direction? Would the entry of Brazil at the OECD even put us in a worse position in terms of these global negotiations, or could it help us, or no difference at all? How do you see this, Rodrigo? So I think I'll stop there, and then after this round of questions, then we'll have closing remarks by both of you as well.
One thing regarding the OECD is that a couple of years ago, OECD, in order to get more legitimacy, they created this inclusive framework, which has 140 countries. But it is exactly as Professor Jayati said, okay? They go there, they sit in the back, they go to, the investor go to Geneva, feel happy, but you don't have much voice. And if you say, she mentioned, firstly, 130 out of these 140 countries signed the deal. Then 6 of them joined laterly: Barbados, São Vicente, Granadinas, Peru, Estonia, Hungria, Irlanda. Look, mainly tax havens and investment hubs. And there are only 4 of them who haven't signed, which is Kenya, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. So most of the people signed. I'm not sure whether they knew what they were signing, but they did, all right? Regarding China multinationals, I wrote this small paper for the FIS, which has the data from these multinational companies, okay? It is interesting to notice that you have the 2-pillar solution. So the first one has to do with the 100 biggest multinationals, these of the digital economy. The second pillar is wider. We're talking about 2.2 or 2.3 thousand enterprises. In the case of the first pillar, they are extremely concentrated, okay? For example, the profits, out of the whole of the profits, almost 2/3 of it are from American companies, 2/3. Then the second, you have China with close to 10% of the total, and then you have a couple countries. So the headquarters of these multinationals are extremely concentrated in a few countries. What is important to notice is that this doesn't mean that the profit is being taxed there. they shift profits to other countries. So not necessarily they're going to be the more affected ones. These countries are going to be the most affected ones. What they are having to do, these companies are going to have to handle the OECD, all their account information globally. So the multinational company from China will have to hand all the paper to OECD. The American one, the Japanese one, the British one, they will have to handle all the paperwork. Then this technical committee linked to the OECD, to the G20, to these multinational organizations, will make the calculations and say how much of the profits is going to be taxed in Brazil, who has the right to tax the additional profit, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so this is basically how it's going to work.
Okay, so Rodrigo, now it's 1:20. We have until 1:30. So I think the way I'll do is the following: you give your closing remarks first, making more general comments on where to go from now. I mean, maybe building the two scenarios. I mean, if the deal is kept the way it is, so what kind of consequences this will have in terms of the future of taxation in Brazil and the developing world? I mean, will this have effects on inequality and growth and our process for development? And the same if the deal isn't signed, and how can we move forward in terms of South-South cooperation in that case, and in our own national framework. So I thank you again already for participating. I'll give you 5 minutes for these closing remarks, and then we end with Professor Jayati. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I won't take the 5 minutes. I will give more time to Professor Jayati because people here already know me. They're probably tired of listening to me. And it's a great pleasure to have her, which is very, very known. And this independent group, which is part of it, together with Ocampo and several, one of our top economists and critical ones. So it's a great pleasure to be here with us. In fact, I was coming from a very pessimistic scenario in terms of political leadership in Latin America, and I'm moving towards a more optimistic one. Okay, maybe the election this year will be a game changing, and then probably we will. Right now, Brazil has inertia in this issue. Okay, we don't have presence in this any presence. We do have a seat, but we don't have a presence in these kind of agreements or tables to negotiate. I think that maybe we're going through a new era for Latin America, for political leaders, maybe old ones, where we have already seen their work, but to get together and then try to get a more organized pressure, because without that, I don't see nothing more to do than to wait for their technical solutions until 2023. Maybe there is a window of opportunity, okay, between the election and the next few months, where we could organize politically a couple of Latin American leaders and try to, until the new meeting, get a more organized, changes, proposals, specific ones. Okay, this part of the residual profit, only 25 to be shared, is too low. We need another kind of redistributive criteria. This of giving the right to the headquarters, it doesn't satisfy us. Maybe we could, yes, make this alternative work. 15% is not good. We may change. So it could be a scenario, and I agree with Professor Jayati that this is the best case scenario, but would involve this political coalition, which I think I may be more optimistic right now than I used to be. In fact, I wrote this paper a couple of years ago, so I was more pessimistic. Right now, I'm moving, I'm changing. So Anyway, thank you for the opportunity. It's a great pleasure to discuss these issues. It's a very serious issue, and it's a great opportunity as well to listen to Professor Jayati here. And thank you for all of you in your time.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Please, Professor Ghosh.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. And thank you so much, Rodrigo. I learned so much listening to you just now. It's really been very informative for me. So thanks a lot. You know, yeah, I'm like Rodrigo, I'm actually optimistic, especially for Brazil. I think it's not, the political situation is changing in lots of Latin American countries, or at least several important Latin American countries. And I think there is more possibility to push in a progressive direction. So just to go back on this question, why do I think it is important to avoid this particular deal right now? Because, you know, I think Rodrigo mentioned that at least it will increase bargaining power versus multinational companies because there is a minimum rate. But, you know, the incentives to shift profits out of Brazil will still exist. 35% to 15%, right? It's a no-brainer. You will still, companies will still continue to shift profit out. And there's no bargaining power because once you've signed on, you've agreed that that's the global minimum. So that I don't think would improve. On the other hand, a digital services tax, which you said, you know, that Brazil can think of doing. No, because you will be signing on saying, I won't do it. The minute you sign on, you're agreeing saying, I'm not going to do any of these unilateral taxes. And then if you try and do any other creative kinds of taxation, suddenly you can be subject to ISDS, to investor state dispute settlement, with arbitration councils that we know about. You know, we've been there. Brazil has been through so many of those. You know exactly what those are all about. They are about protecting private investor interests, private corporations' interests. So those are going to go against you. You're not going to win any of those. Waiting for the technical solutions, again, you see the technical solutions are created in the OECD. And we know what's going on in the OECD. We have observed how the OECD Secretariat has responded at each point. And we know that those technical solutions are not going to be in developing countries' favors. So what does that mean? It means that in operational terms, this deal will actually be hugely negative in terms of inhibiting the kinds of things you were saying, you know, the regional coalitions. If you do get a change, you sign on to this deal, let's say in June, July, you get a change in leadership, you get a government that wants to do something progressive. Well, they can't, their hands are tied. And that I fear, because I think, you know, we are all hoping for progressive change. I mean, nowhere more than in my own country. But we also have to give those new governments the opportunity to be able to do something. We shouldn't be tying their hands in advance. And that is my real concern with accepting this deal. That's why I'm really opposed to accepting this deal. Even though, as I said, the principles are things that we've been fighting for a decade, I feel that this deal would damage our ability to go forward on those principles. Having said that, I think that a progressive government in Brazil could do a lot, and it would be a standard bearer, and it would bring lots of other developing countries who so far have been marginalized, excluded, or just disinterested in this process because they really don't see how it gives them anything, to get galvanized and get moving on this, because we so urgently need positive action on taxation. I think one thing I want to remind everybody, it's not just against developing countries. This deal is against people in the advanced countries as well. Taxpayers and others, citizens in the advanced countries also lose out from this deal. The beneficiaries are multinational corporations who have managed to swing a whole legal process in their favor. So if we can actually resist it and put forward these basic principles, it would be benefiting a much broader global coalition. And I think we have to bear this in mind, that we need allies in the North because they also are losing from this process. And you know, the global tax justice movement is aware of this. There are organizations in the North who are aware of this. We need to be working along with them to be fighting for this. And finally, just to mention that there is another unilateral thing that Brazil can do, which is to create a national wealth register or asset registry. It is something which, you know, we cannot tax the high net worth individuals because we don't know what they're holding. We don't even have an idea who's holding what where. So one of the other things this independent commission that I'm a member of has been fighting for is national asset registers in as many countries as possible with the information to be shared globally, so that we can actually track who is sending money where, and we can, now with most wealth is held in financial assets and property. These are things we can find. It's okay, there's some in paintings and some in yachts and stuff like that, but the dominant part of wealth, private wealth, is held in assets that we can track. So if we can create national asset registers, once again, that creates a huge capability of a progressive government to be able to tax the richest at least the same as you're taxing, let us say, domestic workers. So that we would be able to subject the richest also to the basic principles of fair taxation. I think there's a lot that can be done. And like Rodrigo, I'm really hopeful. I think there can be change. We have to just make sure that the progressive governments have the space with which to make those changes.
Thank you, Rodrigo Orair. Thank you, Professor Jayati Ghosh. I would also like to thank Nexo Jornal for helping us at the Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequality to organize this event. Thank you all the participants for the great questions. And I would encourage all of you to then look for the video that will come with subtitles in Portuguese and promote this video, publish in your social media, because I think as we just conclude, there's only a couple of months before the end of these negotiations, and maybe this debate here can also help shedding light to these issues to a more general audience. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.